Melbourne is in the process of building a major new orbital rail line that should dramatically change how people get around the city by train, and will mean that journeys made between certain major suburban centres will no longer require passengers to go all the way into the city and back out again. That project is the Suburban Rail Loop, and it has the potential to be a very important addition to orbital transport in Melbourne. But it's not going to be the one I talk about in this video. Instead, today I'm going to be looking at an orbital rail line, or lines, that are much older, with those being Melbourne's lost outer and inner circle railways. Apart from a small section, these lines mostly don't exist anymore, but when they did, they provided an orbital-style service across the city's inner and middle ring suburbs, much like the Suburban Rail Loop will be doing when it's opened. So in this video, I'm going to be looking at why these lines were built, what routes they took, and why they, for the most part, don't exist anymore. I'm also going to be asking, given Melbourne is currently spending billions to build a new orbital railway, if removing them was a mistake, and if there might be any value in bringing them back. Hi all, I'm City Moose and I make videos about transport and urbanism, so if that sounds interesting to you, consider subscribing to the channel. And if you want to support the channel, you can check out my Ko-fi, it is always appreciated. But back to the topic of orbital railways, if you're familiar with Melbourne's rail network, you probably know it has a very radial layout. Essentially, all of its lines start somewhere out in the suburbs before heading towards the city centre, without ever really crossing over any other lines to provide interchanges. This, of course, adds some limitations to the usefulness of Melbourne's railways, as travelling to any destination that's not on the rail line you're already on will often mean a big detour via the city centre. To an extent, buses help solve this problem by providing some orbital routes, but these are often slow and infrequent, so they leave a lot to be desired. However, back in the day, Melbourne did have more radial options. In 1888, a line called the Inner Circle Line was opened. This line branched off the Upfield line to head eastwards across Melbourne's inner north, before connecting up with the Mernda line. It's worth pointing out neither line was called that back then, but for the sake of simplicity, I'll mostly be calling the stations and lines I mentioned by their modern names in this video. On its way, it would pass two stations, North Carlton and North Fitzroy. There was also a branch line to another station at Fitzroy. These stations would be served by trains out of Southern Cross, which would then typically continue up to the Mernda and Hurstbrigde lines. This link was important at the time, as the section of track between Clifton Hill and Flinders Street Station, well, more specifically Princess Bridge Station, in the city, had yet to open. So this link gave the lines beyond Clifton Hill direct access to the city. This changed in 1901 when that section of track finally opened, as this new line provided a more direct route than the route via North Carlton and Fitzroy, so most city-bound services would use it instead. This sort of started the Inner Circle line's decline, as the vast majority of passenger trains could now bypass it, and even trams provided a pretty decent alternative to the stations at Fitzroy, North Fitzroy and North Carlton. Even still, the line would keep going. It got electrified in the 1920s, with the exception of that branch to Fitzroy, which had at this point just become a freight line after passenger services ceased in 1892. The line even continued to have decent service frequency, with trains coming as often as every 15 minutes, which is better than some of Melbourne's train lines get today, with most services running out of Princess Bridge Station, up to Clifton Hill, and then across the Inner Circle line to potentially go as far as Royal Park. However, passenger numbers continued to fall, and as a result, services kept getting cut until eventually in 1948, passenger service on the line ceased altogether. From this point on, the line would continue as a freight line, primarily serving goods sidings in Fitzroy and letting freight trains bypass the busy city core, but then in 1981, the line closed for good, with the bulk of its alignment now being turned into the Inner Circle Rail Trail Linear Park that runs across Melbourne's inner north. Now, the Inner Circle Railway is not Melbourne's only lost orbital rail route. There was another, even bigger one, that being the Outer Circle Railway. Despite its name suggesting it was more of an outer version of the Inner Circle line, the two weren't that related, with the Inner Circle line being based in Melbourne's inner north and the Outer Circle line focusing on the city's east. The line opened at a similar time to the Inner Circle line, between 1890 and 1892, but was overall much longer. It started just after Fairfield Station on the Hurstbrigde line, where it branched off and headed south for stations at Fulham Grange, Willsmere, East Kew, Deep Dean and Shenley before reaching the Belgrave and Lilydale lines roughly where East Camberwell station is. The section beyond East Camberwell is the only part of the line that still exists today, as the Alamein line, and runs to stations at Riversdale, Wilson, Hartwell, Burwood, Ashburton and Alamein. It's worth noting, at this point Alamein station didn't actually exist and would be added later. After this, the line reached what we now know as the Glen Waverley line, roughly where East Melbourne station sits today. At this point, the Glen Waverley line didn't extend any further, and instead joined with the Outer Circle line to proceed south to link with the Pakenham and Cranbourne lines via a station at Waverley Road. This is basically the full extent of the Outer Circle line, and to put it mildly, the line was pretty short-lived. The section between Fairfield and Camberwell only lasted about 2 years before its closure, with the other parts of the line barely lasting 5 years. That said, some parts of the line did get reopened, including the line we now know as the Alamein line, which is still serving passengers to this day, as well as the section just north of Camberwell to Deepdean, although passenger services on that section closed again in the 1920s before the track was removed in the 1940s. If the Outer Circle line still existed today, it would provide orbital connections between Melbourne's Mernda and Hurstbrigde, Belgrave, Lilydale and Glen Waverley, and Pakenham and Cranbourne lines, which is a lot of new interchange opportunities, so the way people travel around Melbourne's eastern suburbs would have undoubtedly looked very different. But, unfortunately, all that remains of the Outer Circle line is the Alamein line, and that doesn't even connect with the nearby East Melbourne station. Like the Inner Circle line, most of the line's alignment has now been turned into linear parks, and in some parts of these parks you can still see the old catenary that would have carried the line's overhead wires. So then why did the Outer Circle line close? Well, again, the story is quite similar to the Inner Circle line. If you wanted to use the line to get to the city, the route wasn't very direct and new railway lines and trams often provided more convenient journeys. The land around the line's stations was also quite sparsely populated. One of the reasons both lines were built was to drive up land prices around the new stations and encourage property development. Unfortunately, roughly at the time the lines were opened, Australia was suffering a major property crash, where house prices dropped around 50%, so the property development and population did not arrive in time for the new lines, which ended up often just running through empty paddocks. Again, this is a pity because now Melbourne's population is a lot bigger, there would probably be a lot more demand for this line, and the various interchanges it offers would go a long way to making the city's rail network less focused on trips just between the suburbs and the city centre. At present, there doesn't seem to be many plans to revive either line, and there are some decent reasons for that. For starters, the parks that the lines have been turned into have become quite popular with their local communities, and reopening the train lines would see these parks lost. Additionally, a lot of the areas around these old lines are still quite well served by trams, so there's no urgent need to get them better public transport. And, especially along the Outer Circle line's alignment, these areas also remain quite low density, with mostly single-family homes, and aren't home to any major hubs. If we compare that with the Suburban Rail Loop, that project is very specifically about connecting major suburban hubs like Box Hill, Monash University and Doncaster, as doing so will provide a better bang for your buck than just connecting a few low-density suburbs. With all that said though, I still think there would be value in bringing these lines back in one form or another. The Suburban Rail Loop will go a long way to improving the connectivity of Melbourne's more outer suburbs, but that still leaves a lot of room for improvement for the city's inner and middle ring areas. The Suburban Rail Loop is also very, very expensive, in part because it involves a lot of tunnelling, completely new rights of way, and building complex underground stations. The old routes of the Outer and Inner Circle lines are mostly still intact, so said lines could be built predominantly above ground without the need for acquiring new rights of way. To keep it even cheaper, I could see the lines being brought back as tram or light rail lines, which would also let them fit more nicely into the parks the old alignments run down. Trams through parks have worked quite well in other places. Wimbo Park along Sydney's light rail comes to mind. If we wanted to really dream, the Inner and Outer Circle light rail lines could be connected up with what is currently the number 82 tram to create an almost complete loop that provides interchanges with most of the city's railway lines, a sort of inner loop to the Suburban Rail Loop's outer one. As I said though, that's all just wishful thinking, and at the moment the old Inner and Outer Circle railways do look like they will continue to remain things of the past. I do think this is a pity, as these old alignments do present an opportunity for a sort of transit quick win. Bringing them back in some form would likely be relatively quick and cheap, and would substantially improve Melburnians' options for orbital public transport. For the meantime though, construction on the Suburban Rail Loop is underway, and that is promising to bring such improvements. Plus, who knows, if the initial phase of the Suburban Rail Loop proves successful, and proves that Melburnians do have an appetite for orbital-style rail transport, maybe the Victorian government will start looking around for more ways to provide it. And they may just find the old outer and inner circle railways ready and waiting. Well, as always, I hope you enjoyed today's video. If you did, consider giving it a like and subscribing to the channel. If you really liked it and want to support the channel, do check out my Ko-fi, I do always appreciate it. And if you want to find me elsewhere, my Instagram is @city.moose, and my Twitter/X is @city_moose1. I'm not doing much with either account at the moment, but I may start soon. Regardless, I'm Kyle, aka City Moose, and as always, thanks for watching.